Lowe's Angels, 1954. A small vintage clothing shop on a side street that most people drove past without seeing. A young man in worn jeans and a faded shirt walked through the door, rain still clinging to his hair. The shop owner looked up from behind the counter. What he saw was not a star. He saw someone who looked like he couldn't afford anything in the store. He was about to say so. But what happened next would reveal something the public never quite understood about James Dean. That the person inside the legend was far quieter, far kinder, and infinitely more human than anyone imagined. James Dean was 23 years old when East of Eden premiered, and the world believed it had discovered a new kind of actor, rough, instinctive, dangerous. Someone who burned bright and didn't apologize for it. The studios marketed him as a rebel. The press wrote about his motorcycle. The teenagers who watched him on screen saw an image, a young man who wouldn't conform, who couldn't be tamed. But there was something the cameras didn't capture. Behind the brooding intensity and the carefully cultivated image of a restless outsider, there lived a quiet generosity that almost no one documented. Not because it was secret, not because he was hiding it, but because it didn't announce itself. It didn't perform. It simply was. This is a story about one of those moments. Not a moment of acting or rebellion, not a moment caught by a photographer or recorded in a studio file. It's a moment of simple, human transaction in a place no one would ever write about, where James Dean revealed what he actually valued. It wasn't recognition. It wasn't proving who he was to the world. It was something smaller and perhaps more honest than that. On that rainy afternoon, in a shop that would be forgotten, James Dean walked in as a stranger. The shop owner made an assumption, and in the space of a few minutes, something true about this young man's character became impossible to ignore, even if the world has largely forgotten it ever happened. The shop was called Collector's Corner, a narrow space wedged between a closed laundromat and a shuttered bank office on a stretch of Hollywood Boulevard that was already beginning its slow decline. Inside, the air smelled of old leather and machine oil. Racks of jackets hung like artifacts from another era. Vintage Western shirts with pearl snaps. Used boots with stories embedded in the worn leather. The kind of place where people went not because they were fashionable, but because they were looking for something real, something that had already lived a life and still had wear left in it. The owner was a man named Harold Chen, 56 years old, who had run the shop for nearly a decade. He was not the type to follow Hollywood gossip. He read the trade papers occasionally, knew the names of major studios, but he didn't go to movies often. He was too busy managing inventory, handling difficult customers, keeping the lights on. The economics of Lowe's Angels were shifting beneath everyone's feet, and small business owners felt it first. When the young man came through the door that afternoon, Harold noticed him the way you notice anyone who enters your space. A quick assessment. Wet hair from the rain. No visible signs of wealth. The kind of clothes that suggested he was either genuinely poor or, more likely, performing poverty. And in Lowe's Angels, both types walked through his shop with equal frequency. Harold returned to his paperwork, the cash register, the small decisions that keep a business alive. He had learned over years of retail not to make assumptions too quickly, but he had also learned to protect his inventory. The high-value pieces, the vintage leather, the rare Western wear, were not given handling privileges to every person who walked in off the street. You couldn't afford to be naive in this business. You had to read people. You had to know the difference between a genuine customer and someone just killing time. The young man moved slowly through the shop, his fingers hovering near the merchandise but not quite touching. There was something careful in the way he moved, respectful almost. His eyes moved from jacket to jacket with what seemed like actual consideration, not window shopping, but the deliberate study of someone who understood what he was looking at. Still, Harold watched quietly. To understand what happened next, you have to understand who James Dean was when he wasn't being James Dean. He had grown up in Indiana with very little money. His father was a dentist, respectable, present in form but absent in the way that mattered. His mother had died when he was 9 years old, a loss so profound that he never fully articulated it, but never fully moved past it either. After her death, he was raised partly by an aunt, partly by a series of boarding houses and temporary arrangements. The feeling of not quite belonging, of being the person on the outside looking in, of never quite having a stable place to rest, that was not an affectation for him. That was memory. That was the foundation his personality was built on. By 1954, he was famous. East of Eden had made him something the studios didn't quite know what to do with, too authentic for pure stardom, too young to be taken entirely seriously, but undeniably magnetic on screen. The machinery of fame was waiting for him to step into it completely. There were contracts. There were publicity obligations. There were parties he was supposed to attend, photographs he was supposed to take, the right things he was supposed to say in interviews. But James Dean had made a deliberate choice. He refused most of the publicity apparatus. He drove a motorcycle. He spent time in jazz clubs and small theaters, places where he could be anonymous, where he could disappear into the crowd and just be a person. He sought out genuine people, mechanics, artists, people working without nets, people who had nothing to gain from knowing him. There was a hunger in him, but it was not for recognition. It was for authenticity, for the real. This hunger had its roots in loss. When you lose your mother at 9 years old, the world teaches you something dangerous, that safety is an illusion, that people leave, that the things that matter most can be taken away without warning or permission. Some people respond by grasping for control, by trying to cement themselves into place. Others respond by refusing to pretend. James Dean was the second type. He had learned early that most of what people presented to the world was performance, the carefully constructed self, the image designed to protect you from exposure. He had spent his entire childhood watching adults construct these protective shells, and he had decided, very young, that he would rather be broken and honest than safe and false. When he walked into Collector's Corner on that rainy afternoon, he was not walking in as a famous actor looking for a costume piece. He was not thinking about how a vintage jacket might enhance his image or support the mythology he was building. He was walking in as someone who understood what it meant to wear something that had lived, something that had a history beyond the showroom, beyond the store owner's inventory system. Someone who knew that the truest things, the realest things, were often found in small, overlooked places. He was looking for a jacket, not any jacket, one that would feel like it meant something. After 10 minutes of moving through the shop, the young man approached Harold at the counter. He was holding a leather jacket, a 1940s motorcycle jacket, tan brown, with deep scuffs across the shoulders and a small tear in the lining. It was the kind of piece that most customers would pass by. Damaged goods, incomplete, worn past the point where most people considered it valuable. "How much for this one?" he asked. Harold looked up from his ledger. There was something in the young man's voice, a directness, an absence of pretense, that made him pause before answering, not defensive, not performative, just a straightforward question. "That one's $45, Harold said. The young man nodded slowly. He didn't flinch at the price. Most people flinched. $45 was a significant amount of money in 1954. It was a week's grocery budget for a working family. It was rent for some people. It was the kind of expenditure that required justification. But this young man simply held the jacket, feeling the weight of it, running his thumb across one of the seams. He turned it slightly to examine the tear in the lining. He was assessing it not as a defect, but as evidence of wear, of life lived. "I'd like to buy it," he said. Harold's hesitation came then, not from rudeness and not from malice. It came from what he had learned to recognize in retail, the difference between wanting something and being able to afford it. The young man's clothes suggested the latter. The worn jeans, the faded shirt, the rain-dampened hair, and the absence of any watch, ring, or visible marker of means. $45 was not an insignificant amount of money. "You sure?" Harold asked. His tone was not unkind, but it was protective. He was protecting his business. He was also, perhaps without fully realizing it, protecting the young man from making a decision he might regret. "It's got damage. I can show you something cleaner if you want. Something more reasonable. I've got a couple pieces in the back that are." "I'm sure," the young man said. There was no defensiveness in his voice, no anger at being doubted, just a quiet certainty. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a wallet. He counted out the bills slowly, carefully, laying them on the counter without drama or flourish. One bill at a time. $45, exact. Harold took the bills. His hands moved through the familiar motions of the transaction, making change, wrapping the jacket in brown paper, tying it with string. But his mind was elsewhere. There was something happening in this moment that he couldn't quite name. The confidence in the young man's hands. The way he had handled the money, not carelessly, but not with the desperation of someone stretching their means. The quality of his voice when he corrected Harold's assumption. The absolute absence of the need to prove anything. Only after the transaction was complete, after the young man had thanked him quietly and turned toward the door with the wrapped jacket under his arm, did Harold Chen feel something shift in his understanding of the moment. He had assumed poverty and found solvency. But more than that, he had assumed a kind of desperation and found something closer to intention, to purpose. "Wait," Harold called out, not entirely sure why he was calling, not sure what he wanted to ask or what he hoped to learn. The young man turned back. He was already at the door, already moving toward the street and the rain and whatever came next. But he stopped. He didn't act annoyed at being delayed. He simply turned and waited. "What's your name?" Harold asked. "James," the young man said. His eyes met Harold's without performance, without the glaze of someone performing confidence, just a young man answering a simple question. "James Dean." The name meant nothing to Harold Chen in that moment. It was just a name, James Dean, ordinary, forgettable. But 6 months later, when Harold sat in a darkened theater and saw that same face on the screen, saw the intensity, the vulnerability, the raw authenticity that was being broadcast to thousands of people, something in him registered the connection. He leaned forward in his seat. He watched the young man's hands, the way he moved, the quality of his voice. Yes, it was the same person. Harold Chen never told the story for years. He kept it to himself, the way you keep a small private fact that feels too small or too ordinary to be interesting to anyone else. A customer who bought a jacket, a moment of assumption corrected, nothing spectacular, nothing that changed the arc of history. But after James Dean died, after the car accident in September 1955, barely a year after walking into Collector's Corner, Harold Chen began to understand that the moment had been more significant than he had realized. Not because of who the young man turned out to be, but because of what he had revealed about himself in those few minutes. He had revealed his character. This was not a one-time thing. This was a pattern. In the months that followed the visit to Collector's Corner, people who worked with James Dean, on sets, in rehearsals, in the small theaters where he still appeared when studios weren't controlling his time, reported something consistent. He noticed people others didn't. He remembered details. He asked follow-up questions. A lighting technician named Marcus Webb was struggling with a personal crisis. His wife had left him. He was living out of his car, trying to keep his job, trying to hold himself together. He mentioned it once to James Dean, offhandedly, the way you mention something you've learned to carry in silence. They were on the set of Rebel without a cause, waiting for a scene to be reset. James Dean listened. He didn't just listen and move on. In the weeks that followed, he sought Marcus out. He sat with him during lunch. He asked real questions, not the kind of questions that demand performance, not how are you holding up, but what's the hardest part right now. He brought books about resilience. He introduced Marcus to people he knew who might help. And most importantly, he treated Marcus's struggle not as a tragedy to be sympathized with from a distance, but as a fact of his humanity, as something that mattered. There was a costume designer named Ruth Morno who was worried about her position on the production. She had designed costumes for smaller films, and she was terrified that this bigger production would expose her as inadequate. She mentioned her anxiety once in conversation with James Dean, a brief, vulnerable admission that she immediately regretted. James Dean remembered it. Not only did he remember, he made sure the director heard about her specific contributions. He watched her work. He spoke about it. He positioned her not as someone who needed protection, but as someone whose skill deserved recognition. There was a stunt driver named Stan Kamen who worked with him on Rebel Without a Cause. Stan had a daughter with polio. She was 8 years old. She had complications. She was in and out of hospitals. Stan mentioned it once, in passing, the way you mention something you've learned to carry, the kind of detail you hope people won't ask follow-up questions about because you're not sure you can answer without breaking. James Dean asked follow-up questions, not out of curiosity, out of genuine care. He remembered her name, Margaret. He asked about her schooling. He asked about her doctors. In the years that followed, even as his life became increasingly difficult and complicated, James Dean sent books to Margaret. Books about people who had overcome limitations, not out of pity, out of respect for her as a person with a mind and a future. Years later, after James Dean's death, Stan would say that no one else in Hollywood had ever treated his daughter's existence as a given fact of his humanity, rather than a tragedy to be sympathized with from a distance. No one else had asked her name and then remembered it. No one else had treated her as real. These were not grand gestures. They were not the kind of things that made the newspapers or ended up in studio publicity files. They were small recognitions, the decision to see someone fully, to honor what mattered to them, to assume that everyone deserved that kind of attention. What made this pattern significant was its contradiction. James Dean was famous for his portrayals of alienated, tortured young men. The image was one of self-absorption, of turning inward, of being so consumed by your own intensity that the rest of the world faded into background. That was the mythology. That was what people expected from James Dean. But the man himself seemed to move in the opposite direction. He was attentive. He was generous without announcing it. He asked follow-up questions. He remembered what people had told him. He assumed the best about people, the same way he expected to be assumed the best about. In a world that was increasingly built on surface and performance, especially in Hollywood, where image was everything and authenticity was a marketing tool, James Dean appeared to operate from a different set of values. He seemed to believe that the real work was not in being seen, but in seeing others. When Harold Chen eventually understood who the young man in the leather jacket was, he didn't rush to tell the story. He didn't call the studios. He didn't try to capitalize on the moment. He kept it. He folded it into his private understanding of the world and what it meant to be human. Years later, after James Dean's death, when the mythology had already begun to harden around the actor's image, the rebel, the tragic figure, the beautiful young man who burned too bright, Harold Chen mentioned the story to a few people. But he was careful about how he told it. He wasn't selling a story. He wasn't trying to enhance his own significance by proximity to fame. He was preserving a fact. The fact was this: James Dean had entered a small shop as a stranger. He had been doubted, and he had moved past the doubt without anger, without the need to prove who he was, without the armor of ego. He had simply been honest about his intention, paid what was asked, and moved on. He had treated Harold Chen like a human being. When James Dean died in that car accident on September 30th, 1955, barely a year after walking into Harold Chen's shop, the world mourned the loss of a talent and a symbol. They mourned what he might have become. They mourned the youth and intensity that were suddenly extinguished. Magazines ran special issues. Radio stations played tributes. Teenagers gathered in small groups and wept for someone they had never met but felt they understood. The world mourned James Dean the actor, the image, the legend. But what they didn't mourn because they had never fully seen it was the kindness. The simple, consistent choice to treat people as though they mattered, to see them, to remember them, to ask about their lives and actually listen to the answers. This quality was not visible on screen. It didn't translate to publicity. It wasn't the kind of thing that filled theater seats or sold magazines or created the mythology that would outlive him. In fact, it was almost invisible, which may have been exactly why it was so real. The most authentic parts of who we are often go unseen, noticed only by the people who are directly touched by them. A shop owner, a lighting technician, a costume designer, a stunt driver with a daughter. These people knew something about James Dean that the rest of the world never quite grasped. They knew that inside the troubled young man on the screen there was another person entirely. Someone quieter, someone more generous. Someone who had learned, early in life, that being outside the system, being doubted, being excluded, that these things could teach you something valuable about how to treat other people in the same position. Harold Chen wore that tan-brown leather jacket with the tear in the lining for years. He wore it until it was barely wearable. The seams began to give. The leather cracked and faded, but he kept wearing it. And when people asked him about it, when they saw him in that damaged, worn-out piece and wondered why he didn't simply buy something new, he would tell them the story. Not as a claim to fame, not as a way of connecting himself to a legendary actor, but as a small proof of something he had come to believe about human nature. That the people who truly understand what it means to be outside the system, to be excluded, to be doubted, those people often develop an almost reflex-like kindness toward others in similar positions. James Dean had been doubted his entire life. Not because he was poor. By 1954, he was no longer poor. Not because he was unknown. By 1954, he was becoming famous. But because of something deeper, the sense that he didn't quite fit the mold. That he was too authentic, too raw, too committed to the real to ever be entirely comfortable in a world built on illusion. So when he encountered doubt, in a small shop, from a reasonable man making a reasonable assessment based on incomplete information, he didn't take it as a wound to his ego. He didn't need to prove anything. He didn't perform superiority or offense. He took the doubt as a fact to be worked with. He moved through it with grace, because grace was his instinctive response to people who were simply doing their jobs, trying to survive, making reasonable decisions with the information they had available. This was James Dean when no one was watching, not performing rebellion, not crafting an image for the camera, not trying to prove who he was to anyone. Just a young man in a leather jacket, treating a shop owner with respect, understanding the loneliness and caution that comes from running a small business alone and moving forward with his life. That kindness, that quiet, unannounced, unrewarded kindness, might have been the truest thing about him. The leather jacket James Dean bought that afternoon eventually found its way out of his possession. It was sold, lost, dispersed into the anonymous flow of used goods that move through the world. Nothing lasts. Everything circulates. But the moment itself remained in Harold Chen's memory, and in the memories of everyone who heard the story told with care and without embellishment. What this story tells us about James Dean is not flattering in the way celebrity stories usually are. It doesn't make him larger. If anything, it makes him smaller, more human, more vulnerable, more recognizable than the icon. It tells us that the young man the world saw as a symbol of rebellion and alienation was actually deeply committed to something far more difficult, to the work of truly seeing other people, to the work of moving through the world without the armor of ego or the constant need to prove who you were. In a time when fame was becoming the central mythology of American life, when being recognized was beginning to feel like the ultimate form of validation, the ultimate proof that you mattered, James Dean seemed to believe in something older and deeper. He believed that the way you treated a stranger in a small shop, the way you listened to someone's worry, the way you assumed the best about people who doubted you, the way you remembered someone's daughter's name, these were the things that mattered. These were the things that made you real. He was wrong, of course, in one sense. The world didn't care about these things. The world cared about his face, his talent, his tragic death. These are the things that made him immortal. These are the things that will keep his image alive in the cultural memory for as long as film exists. But the people who knew him, the ones who were touched by his quiet generosity, the ones who were seen by him when they felt invisible, they knew something else. They knew that there was a person inside the legend. That person is worth remembering. That person, in fact, might have been the most important thing about him. Not the actor, the man. Here's what I want to ask you. Have you ever been doubted by someone, misjudged based on appearance or circumstance or incomplete information, and chosen grace instead of defense? What did that moment teach you about who you were and who you wanted to be? Tell me in the comments. I'm reading everyone. If you believe these untold stories matter, the quiet moments that reveal real character, the small kindnesses that never make the headlines, subscribe to this channel. We're telling the human stories behind the legends, stories that change how you see the people you thought you already knew.